Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We have an exciting visitor today, Jeremy De Valck. Jeremy is an environmental economist, and he's done his undergraduate and double Master of Science degrees on bioscience engineering and also natural resource management. And then after that, you worked in the GIS industry for a couple of years before you started your postdoc at the John Rolfe's lab at the Central Queensland University, based here in Brisbane. And Jeremy studies non-market valuation of ecosystem services and biodiversity. And today he'll be talking about how do we value the biodiversity and ecosystem services of the Great Barrier Reef. You have the stage. Please welcome Jeremy.
Thanks very much. And just one thing, before doing the postdoc, I had to do a PhD. That's how it works, right? So I did a PhD in Leuven in Belgium, actually on the valuation and mapping of cultural ecosystem services over there in the northern part of Belgium. All right, so good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how to estimate the economic value of biodiversity in the Great Barrier Reef. That's obviously a big topic. In the way that I originally designed the presentation, I realized that it was maybe a bit too much looking like a lecture. So later on I switched to presenting a couple of case studies and papers I've been working on. I think that might be a little more interesting to you. I didn't know exactly the type of audience that I would have, like mostly ecologists or maybe a couple of economists. So apologies in advance if certain concepts are perhaps a little easy or very, very familiar to you, or on the contrary, if they might be a little far-fetched, but I'm very happy to answer all questions at any time. So let's go. Just a quick word about Central Queensland University. We're obviously a small university, started in 1967 in Rockhampton, which is still the headquarters, with 16 campuses across 5 states and 5 in regional Queensland. It remains a very regional university. That's actually one of the objectives of that university, to touch the regional areas in priority. We've got more than 30,000 students from 70 countries, and actually we do a lot of distance education. And what do I do at CQU? Well, so I'm part of Professor John Rolfe's lab, so the Applied Economics Research Group. So John's been active in that area for more than 20 years now. So in the field of environment, resource economics, agricultural economics, and regional development, with a specific focus on the Great Barrier Reef area. As for me, I've been working over the past 3 years on a number of projects. Many of them were in the area of Gladstone. So, for example, I contributed to the Gladstone Healthy Harbour report cards every year. Building indicators to see how the harbour is doing environmentally, culturally, socially, and economically. Also, working on different projects there, like mud crabs, ecotoxicology, fish health, this sort of thing. Most of my work is related to water quality issues in the Great Barrier Reef. Obviously, my specialty is more non-market valuation and discrete choice experiment, choice modeling in particular. And I've been working on both case studies or more like theoretical, conceptual papers. And this year I just joined the newly created research centers that has been created by CQU in Gladstone. That's called CMERC, the Coastal Marine Ecosystem Research Center. Just in a nutshell, what I'm going to talk about today, the Great Barrier Reef and its biodiversity, obviously. Why shall we try to value biodiversity economically? How can we do that, like different approach that exists? Then I'll switch to the different cases that I've been concretely working on. Bringing up some challenges and future directions for research, and I'll finish with some take-home messages. So I'll be quick on this because I'm sure that you at least most of you know about the Great Barrier Reef, but it's obviously a very iconic ecosystem. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Area since 1981. It's the size, more or less the size of Japan or Germany, the largest coral reef ecosystem in the world. Very rich in biodiversity, obviously, with a bunch of iconic species. For example, it hosts 6 of the 7 species of marine turtles, with the hawksbill sea turtle being endangered, but also like fin whales, whale sharks, etc. And this rich biodiversity is also very attractive in the sense that we have almost like 3 million visitors to going to the reef every year, obviously then generating a lot of economic returns. We have evaluated in a recent publication that the total economic value generated from commercial fishing, recreation, and tourism was about $3.6 billion a year. So it's really substantial, and that's probably a first reason to pay a closer look at the reef. So why valuing biodiversity? Well, obviously the reef is subject to a number of threats. Water quality issues from agricultural pollution, for instance, climate change, by far the most important, coastal development, etc. And as you're definitely aware of, last year we learned from the IPBES report that there's now more than 1 million species on the verge of extinction. There's an accelerating rate of biodiversity loss with potentially dramatic impacts on human well-being. So that's another reason to pay attention to the value of biodiversity. But more importantly, and that's maybe more generally related to the purpose of valuing the environment, is just to buy yourself a seat at the table of decision makers. You need to speak their language. I know it's probably a bit cynical, but these decision makers tend to value different projects, different planning alternatives based on money, and money has to be considered as the indicator that is the most easily understandable by those decision makers. And valuing biodiversity economically also increase awareness about the issues, and hence can help develop spending on biodiversity conservation. And it's also a way to reconcile protection value with other uses of the reef, such as recreation or tourism, obviously. So how does one value environmental assets in general? So there's a first way to look at it. I'm sure you're very familiar with this concept of sustainable development, where sustainable development lies at the intersection between the economy, society, and the environment, right? There's a different vision to that, which is a sustainability egg, so to speak, where economy is only seen as a restricted part of what makes human societies, right? It's just regulating the transactions made between human beings, but as human civilization, we are way more than just the transactions that we make. That's the idea. And all of us as society, we're also limited by the finite environment we live in, with planet Earth basically, so the environment. And so those ideas are a bit what drives two different visions to similar problems. So originally, environmental economics is the subfield of economics that started getting interested into environmental issues, while ecological economics has been more like environmental scientists getting interested in economics as a tool to address that same issue. So obviously a different point of view, because economists will first look for, well, to calculate value, economic value, how to maximize welfare as a societal level, while ecological economists would start from the ecosystem. We've got those limits we need to work in, and how can we adapt accordingly? Environmental economics and economics in general is not really interested in making moral judgments. They don't want to look like activists, while ecological economists, well, actually, that's this this discipline is kind of grounded in the environmentalist movement that started in the 70s. And obviously they want to make a moral judgment because they bring the fact that maybe we do not need an anthropocentric vision of the world where biodiversity itself matters, not necessarily the use that we can make out of it, this sort of thing. So environmental economics normally doesn't make that. But it brings an analytical rigor from the economics science, while ecological economics tries new and diversified approaches. It's more of a transdisciplinary discipline, taking elements from like geography, ecology, sociology, psychology, these sort of things, right? And yeah, environmental economics is effective in influencing policymaking through the monetary valuation aspects, while ecological economics tends to propose new perspectives. So these are just two visions of the same problems. They are not necessarily fundamentally opposed. I believe that in the future they're going to increasingly merge, but I just wanted to mention that so you probably better understand where we come from when I mention different techniques later on. So here we stand from the environmental economics point of view. When we try to value the environment, we can think of it as trying to calculate the total economic value of environmental assets, which are made of a use value component and non-use value components. So the use value components is, for instance, the direct use, like in the term for the Great Barrier Reef, that can be the fish that we extract directly right from the sea and that we can sell through the market. That's a direct use of the resources generated from this ecosystem. But plankton, for example, is something that has no real market value, but it's necessary for the production of fish that we consume or sell later on. So it's indirectly necessary. Option value is often a type of value that is associated with biodiversity because it's basically the value that an ecosystem has for its capacity to fulfill certain needs that haven't been identified yet. So it's a bit of an insurance value, if you want. And regarding the non-use values, those are a bit the most intangible ones that are somehow quite related one with another, but less easy to measure in general. So you have the pure existence value. I know people in Europe who would be ready to pay a little bit just to preserve the Great Barrier Reef, even if they would never go there, just for the pure existence value. Bequest value is a bit the same. It's like, I may never go to the reef, but I'm ready to pay a little bit so my grandchildren may one day enjoy it. And that's the same idea with altruistic values. Like, I'm not going to enjoy it personally, but I'm ready to pay for others to enjoy it. Another way to look at the problem that you're probably more familiar with is the ecosystem services, right? Biodiversity being considered as the necessary structure and processes that enable the creation of ecological functions and supporting services like soil formation, nutrient cycles that eventually enable the production of final ecosystem services that we can enjoy. So like provisioning services, like I said, fish, food production, timber, this sort of thing, regulation and maintenance, like flood regulation, climate regulation, and cultural ecosystem services like the spiritual value of nature, the aesthetic value of nature, or the recreational value of nature. And the idea is that once we have identified those ecosystem services, we see the benefits, we see how it contributes to our well-being as a society, and we convert it into an economic value. This economic value can help build some responses to alleviate the pressures on biodiversity and the environment later on. So that's just to say that it's a different way to look at it, starting from the ecosystem this time. Whatever stance you take, there's a number of valuation techniques that exist to concretely measure economic value. There's basically three main families of techniques that can be used. I have no time to go through all of them, and I'm definitely no specialist in all of them, so I'll be rather quick, at least with the two first families. But direct market valuation, well, you can estimate the economic value of environmental asset through their market price, or based on replacement cost for the kind of services that it provides to society. For example, coastal protection from the reef, the avoided cost that would be like the amount of infrastructure that would be destroyed if the reef is not there. It's an approximation of its protection value, this sort of thing. Production-based, this is a way to include ecological productivity in the normal production function. That is a function of labor and capital, but here we try to estimate the ecological productivity as well. But the problem with that is that it can only estimate the use value, and that's also the problem with revealed preference methods. Although revealed preference methods can be very interesting for certain usage, travel cost is very interesting for recreation, like estimating the value of recreation. The cost that you're willing to bear to reach a certain site, let's say like a beautiful beach along the reef, well, you're bearing cost by driving your car, for example, and all the maintenance costs and so on attached to it, the opportunity costs of the time that you use to travel there as well. And because you're supposed to enjoy that whole experience at least as much as the cost that you pay to get there, well, the travel cost is like a minimum value of that you can put on the experience itself. Hellenic pricing is a different technique that has to do with comparing housing prices for houses that are located near green spaces or not, and see how the presence of vegetation, for example, near some houses does influence the market price. And based on that, you can infer the aesthetic value brought by the nearby nature, for example. But I've been mostly working on stated preference methods, because they are the ones that allow you to calculate both use values and non-use values, so that's interesting. Those techniques rely mostly on surveys, so we're gonna ask hypothetical questions to people in surveys to see whether they would be willing to pay to see certain improvements taking place, for example, to natural assets. A recent book by Bartosz Bartowski has demonstrated that out of this, all of these techniques, actually two stated preference techniques are very well adapted to value biodiversity. The first one are discrete choice experiments, and the second one is deliberative monetary evaluation. So when you do discrete choice experiment, basically you try to describe a hypothetical scenario. For example, here that's like an improvement made to the Great Barrier Reef in terms of area of coral reef in good health, number of fish species that can be present, the area of seagrass that would be present in different scenarios. So you have different attributes that are translated in terms of levels and different alternatives, and you have always a cost attribute, and you want to know what people trade off in this sort of situation. So basically, yeah, you give that multiple times to a number of respondents, and later on you analyze that in a statistical model, and that's how you're capable of seeing what attributes are particularly important to people. And it's interesting for biodiversity because it can control for the multidimensionality of biodiversity and the uncertainty in biodiversity itself. so through these attributes and level. Deliberative monetary valuation is slightly different. Here, instead of asking each respondent individually to fill up this sort of questionnaire, you just put people around tables and you ask them to find an agreement on the value that they attach to different scenarios. So you look for the consensus value. So it's very interesting when you want to put different stakeholders around the table in a complex issue and see whether an agreement can be found as well. Just going to talk now about different cases I've been working on. So that was a paper I published about 2 years ago now. The government has launched the Reef water quality improvement plan, but in order to reduce water pollution in the Great Barrier Reef, so the pollution that comes from nutrients, sediments, and pesticides. But the progress that has been made so far are not so good, actually. So the idea was to see, okay, for every percent that we are diverging from the actual targets, what does that cost to society? Or else said, what would be the benefits of improving water quality by a mere 1%? That's often what we want to do as economists. We don't want to see like whether we replace 100% of one thing by another, but we just want to see at the margin how do cost and benefit vary. So what we've been doing is looking at the different regions of the Great Barrier Reef and seeing, okay, how much pollutants do we have in each of these regions, like sediments, nutrients, pesticides. How is that supposed to influence ecosystem health? Like we selected 3 ecosystems, mangroves, seagrass, coral reefs, and selected also certain ecosystem services that would be impacted. Here we just selected recreation, tourism, and fishing. And the idea is then, okay, we could put monetary value on it. So this is pretty much how we did it. So we looked at the changes in pollutant loads across a different region. We looked at the ecosystem covers for those different ecosystems. We included some sensitivity factors because obviously different types of ecosystems are differently affected by those pollutants, and multiplied by ecosystem services values that we could calculate for these ecosystem services, we could finally obtain the marginal changes in benefits associated with marginal changes in water quality. The conclusions that we arrived to was that a 1% improvement in water quality would have an influence of a consequence of $22,000 a year for commercial fishing, that industry, for about $500,000 a year for recreation, and close to $7 million a year for tourism, a mere 1%. This is another case study that I'm working on right now. It's in preparation. We did that survey mid of last year. And here we're interested in looking at the trade-offs that respondents can make between the environmental values of the reef and the amenity values. So for the environmental values, we looked into the amount of coral, changes in coral cover, for example, and seagrass cover. And for amenity values, potential positive or negative impacts on recreation or tourism. This is just very preliminary results, but we already see like some positive results for the presence of coral, seagrass, tourism. The perception that people had ex ante of the condition of the reef seems to be also like a positive factor that influences willingness to pay positively. And negatively, well, if people had already donated in the past, for example, for a eco-friendly organization, that seems to have a slight negative effect. And there's a couple of other factors like that. Yeah, if they had visited the reef already in the past, and basically all perceptions of the threats that exist on the reef are obviously seen negatively. But that's very preliminary results. Another paper I'm working on, actually, it's not too much of a case, actually. It's more of a conceptual and literature review paper, but it's about the use of proxies, actually, to value biodiversity protection. So as you know, biodiversity is a complex thing, right? And it's very habitat specific. It's still largely unknown, right? We know now that 85% of eukaryotes are still not known, actually, not even described. So, biodiversity itself, as you've seen with the choice experiments or the state preference methods that we use, we need to find a way to explain that to lay people, and it's sometimes hard to translate into terms that people can actually easily understand to make their choices. So that's some of the reason to go for biodiversity proxies, so approximations for that concept. What I found out is basically we have three main categories of proxies that have been used in the literature. The first ones are the ones that are focusing on species. So for example, you've got like apex predators that can be used as a proxy for a whole, for biodiversity in an entire ecosystem. So the idea is that why valuing the entire ecosystem if you have this top predator that is actually there because the whole ecosystem is thriving, right? That's much easier if you can just value one than all the elements of it, right? The problem is such species, for example, is very mobile, so it's actually difficult, well, already to put an economic value on it, but also to determine the area that we cover, right, for example. Other species like humpback whale, it's very charismatic, so people can really represent it easily, so willingness to pay can be easily estimated for that because it talks to people. But it may be hard to represent the whole ecosystem, right? Because in the trophic chains, it's not as easy as with the shark, for example. And it's also a migratory species, so associating it with a certain ecosystem is complex. Then one could use also quantitative measures of diversity, which probably aligns better with the ecological concepts behind biodiversity in general. So like the Shannon Diversity Index, this sort of thing. It's more accurate, but again, if you put that into a choice experiment, I'm sure that many people actually wouldn't know what you're talking about. So the problem is like it's too technical, there's a cognitive burden attached to it. We want to avoid that, or at least then you need to spend some time informing your respondents first so that they know what you're talking about. And a final species-based proxy is to look at endangered species. So like the IUCN red listed ones. One positive aspect is like it's easy and it's also meaningful to people. The problem is like it's also very species specific, and people tend to have like very marked preferences for some key species in a, it's not a word that I should use, but perhaps a bit of an irrational way sometimes, like at least it's questionable the types of preferences that they may have sometimes. Another way to processes, assuming that biodiversity is the necessary condition to maintain ecosystem health, resilience, resistance to invasive species, and prevents the whole ecosystem to collapse, so to speak, right? So the idea is that the presence of invasive species, for example, or the level of intactness of an ecosystem could be used as a proxy for biodiversity. It's another way to bypass the complexity of biodiversity and it's obviously prone to certain biases because that there might be some confounding factors there, and it's inaccurate. But when it comes to doing this sort of choice experiment and asking people whether they are willing to pay for different management decisions like improving water quality, that's actually something that translates relatively well, like in these studies from my colleagues John Wolf and Jill Windle, where they calculated that people were willing to pay about $22 per household per year for 5 years to see that sort of improvement. And so, yeah, here what I did was to review like all the studies basically that looked into producing economic values of biodiversity or more generally environmental assets in the Great Barrier Reef and in Australia over the past 35 years. So there were 62 studies, 33 in the whole GBR. I categorized them by whether they used the total economic value aspects or the ecosystem services methods that I mentioned earlier, and also by the type of proxies that they were using. And so we have a pretty fair split between the three categories, with 32% of the studies using species, 45% using habitats, and 23% using processes. Species-based proxies were mostly calculating the direct use values, so that's all the studies that have to do with wildlife tourism or recreational fishing. Outside of the reef, the Ningaloo's whale shark, for example, there's large literature about that. And it seems like in that particular sort of case, it could be a good proxy to look into the whale shark, because it's really like the sort of situation where you have one species that almost entirely generates the touristic attraction in one location, right? But it might not be necessarily valid in the Great Barrier Reef. The habitat ones were the ones, the more general studies, like the recent Deloitte Access Economics one, for example, that looked into tourism, recreation, and commercial fishing at the whole GBR level for most of them. And finally, the process one were the ones testing different management options. So, for example, willingness to pay for conservation zones, diminishing greenhouse gases, or improving water quality. So, there's still some challenges, of course. As you can see, all the proxies that I've mentioned, they all come with certain limitations, right? Either it's too narrow, or it's too broad, can be too simple to express in some choice experiment, or too complex. But it's still hard to value diversity itself, and that's probably some part that is still missing from the literature, at least. Multi-attribute options could be an option, actually. Could be a desirable compromise when we want to value the different components of biodiversity at once. And we need to make sure that when we do biodiversity valuation in the future, that needs to be policy relevant, because obviously we need to keep in mind that what we want is to influence decision making towards paying more attention to conservation, right? So we probably need to be selective in the types of proxies that we use, so that we can also generate the highest values, right? And it needs to be respectful of all impacted stakeholders. So just a few take-home messages. So we've seen that there's two main approaches to value biodiversity. Either you take an environmental economics stance and you look more into values, you opt for the total economic value approach, or you start by looking at ecosystems and you take more of an ecological economic stance, so you use the ecosystem services vision. There's actually many valuation techniques that exist. but I had no time to go through. I'm sorry for that. But the stated preference one are very suitable for biodiversity. Like I said, for their capacity to value both use and non-use values, for example. Biodiversity proxies offer some solution, but they all have their limitations. And understanding biodiversity and estimating its economic value will be increasingly important as it is getting lost, because there's a general rule in economics that everything that is scarce, right, gains value, right? So that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.
So we have heaps of time for questions. Any questions?
I was just surprised that a section of threats actually affects the willingness to pay negatively. If I'm not
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's still preliminary results, honestly. It was really, I just put some things together there. But yeah, the presence of threats, yeah. People could think that, because that environment is already threatened, why should we pay more attention to it? You know, this also with the threshold effect that I mentioned at some point. It's always the dilemma. It's like, shall we preserve the pristine areas, or should we restore the highly degraded ones? That's always a bit like the trade-off that is being made. I think this sort of results also help, getting more insight into this, what people actually think about that. Yeah.
It could be bimodal either.
Pardon?
Could be a bimodal distribution, that you have a large portion who has a negative value because I think it's already lost. And then a small group of people think, now we should definitely try to save this.
Yeah, could be. I need to split the sample and do some like latent class model or this sort of thing to dig a little deeper in that. Yeah.
I'm interested in how you handle the uncertainties about the relationship between increasing the water quality and the state of the habitats. Because that's obviously spatially variable as well. So there's a lot of, how do you handle that when you come up with, one number, 22,000, right?
In that case studies that I'm currently working on, so we have two experiments. We have one at the whole GBR level, and one with differences that we sort of made specific to the six natural resource management regions of the Reef to account for those specific differences. In the other paper, we started from the scientific consensus statement about water quality in the Great Barrier Reef, and they have very specific figures about the pollutant loads for those six NRM regions across the reef. So that was my starting point for that. But I totally agree that there's some assumptions being made there about that amount of pollutants will have that sort of effect. Yeah, exactly. That's a trade-off to be made. I mean, I guess it's a general rule with environmental economics. It's like when we try to estimate a value, it's very often like a minimum value because there's many aspects of it that we still don't fully grasp. Hopefully, over the years, we'll be able to, put a price tag on these most intangible aspects as well, like the non-use values, the existence, bequest, altruistic values, all that. At the moment, that's all we have to value the environment. And, I know it's still flawed and or at least inaccurate, but that's the best we've got to actually make the point that the environment also has value. I'm not sure that actually answers.
No, it's just sort of like that conservativeness, like so we take the lowest options.
Yeah, and every measurement that we made was conservative. Like every time we had ranges and so on, I had to create the most conservative option. Yeah. So it's really like a minimum value. And that's why actually, when I started by saying like the total economic value generated by the reef from commercial fishing, recreation and tourism is about $3 billion a year, right? And then the numbers that I showed for marginal improvement were obviously much more smaller, and that's also due to all these correcting factors to make sure that we have a conservative approach. Yes?
Just a big question, which is, do you see a mechanism by which these externalities could be embedded within the economic system rather than, like I really like your work, you're valuing the systems, but one of the challenges is it's not embedded within decision making. So when you make an economic decision, the environmental impact of that decision is not there. And that's one reason why we have to value it. Do you see a mechanism by which that can actually be embedded within our economic system?
I guess it's tricky because you would need to have a clear understanding of all the consequences of what we do when two parties exchange products in the market. Say like a coal mining industry producing coal and someone buys coal, it obviously has a lot of impact on third parties, but up to a point that where it's hard to actually put it on. Already just evaluating the biophysical aspects of it is complex, but then converting it into monetary terms, that's even harder. So maybe in the future we'll get there and we'll arrive to fully internalize those externalities. I guess at the moment we're still trying to find ways to put dollar values on it as much as possible.
What do you think that would require as an economist?
I would need to think about it, honestly. It's a big question. I'm sure we do not pay the real price for what we buy in general, and that would probably be like everything would be much more expensive. That's one thing, because the moment you need to internalize all these social costs that are borne by all of us, well, and we need to each of us to pay our part. Yes, that would be a way. Honestly, I don't know. At least at this stage, it's a very big question.
I have a question. The two studies, the one where you estimated the percentage change of water quality, and the one discrete choice experiment where you included the amenity values. Mm-hmm. In those studies, how did you define recreation and tourism, and how did you make sure it wasn't overlapping? Yeah. And did you make an attempt to figure out the contribution of the actual ecosystem asset to the value, and not like the food or the comfort of the vessel you're sitting on? Did you take that into account?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way we traditionally differentiate recreation and tourism, recreation is your local population going to the beach on a regular basis, for example. So we approximate it through the local population living in there, because it's usually like day trips. Let's go to the beach today, and But tourism is more domestic and international travels to the GBR with a specific intention to spend some time there, usually in hotels, in resorts and all that. So it generally accounts for accommodation cost, flight cost and this sort of thing. That's why it's much higher as well, right? Because then people are expected to spend more time on site as well.
I'm just asking that because I'm grappling with that, not just a couple of specific groups. Where would that fall in? If you have recreational fishers who go for overnight trip, is tourism or is that recreation? What about people who don't stay in hotels for 3 days but on a free campsite? Is that tourism or is that recreation? So
yeah, those are the factors that,
I wonder just how you grapple with that in your choice experiment, to not have a lot of correlation between the attributes, for example, how you've done that.
Yeah, good point. Well, that's definitely something
you need to nobody has solved it yet. That's why I'm asking. I thought maybe you have a great idea how to do it.
Well, okay. I can give you a cheap answer that's like, we did focus groups and we tested on the people, and they seem to be fine with that, and they seem to understand two concepts fairly well. So, and the variables behaved adequately in the model later on.
Because I saw one was significant and the other was insignificant in the choice experiment models.
Yeah, but it's still very preliminary results. I'm sorry.
I'll take that. Okay.
Yeah, I'll send you the updated results.
I was really interested, like, so
definitely.
I just trying to figure out that one myself.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we try to control for that in the survey as well, asking for additional questions, like when you go to the reef, do you specifically go for that reason, or what do you do? And then after, it's a bit of cleaning up in the model, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
With the asking people about stated preferences, who do you ask? Is there a difference between people that live close to the reef versus people that live far from the reef? I was wondering who they are.
Yeah, that's a good question. But again, that depends on what you try to observe. So we did some choice experiment in the past where we, for example, let's say about tourism to the Great Barrier Reef. Well, obviously you have like some very some hot spots for tourism around the reef, like Cairns, for example, is a big one. So you want maybe to sample people, specifically from this area, because you know you will have a lot of visitors, right? You want to maximize your chance to have actual users, direct users. It depends on what you want to grasp. Usually, that's interesting to have these two groups. And maybe actually do some split sample analysis to see whether you have differences between the direct users, the ones that you have that have a fair probability of, because they live nearby, they will just go more often, and the ones who would need to take the plane or at least travel for a whole day to be there, you know. That was something that I did also in Belgium in recreational studies with the choice experiment as well, and where I actually looked at the distances covered, you know, by all the respondents to actually go to certain sites, and based on what is realistic to cover in a single day, well, there I picked a little bit like, you know, the ones who are more likely to be direct users from the ones who might be more like casual users. We do ask questions as well in the survey on how frequently people visit the reef, for example, the sort of use that they make of it. So that's the thing that maybe I didn't mention or not sufficiently clearly, is like when you do a choice experiment, it always comes with a whole survey through which you ask a whole bunch of questions to, you know, before you actually get to the different choice cards that you present to them. So they have also like a little, you know, sometimes to get accustomed to the question that you are actually asking. You know, we tell them, okay, this is the reef, and that's the issue, and okay, how much do you know the reef? How much do you know about this issue, that issue? Because for us, it's quite common talk, you know, like we all know more or less about what's going on in the reef, and then we all have some background knowledge. But for common people, it's really like it's starting. It's really starting from. That sounded a little, yeah. Anyway, it's just sometimes hard to translate in the person's story. That's what I was trying to say.
Just sticking along the lines from the question that Kay just asked about the 6 instrument, how can we make it use to actually improve the health of the ecosystem? Do you think we could perhaps calculate portfolios such as, well, if the government would reduce carbon emissions by such a percentage, that would actually lead to improvement of corals by such and such percent, and that would increase tourism by, I don't know how many millions, something like that. Do you think that could be perhaps used?
I guess that could be an option.
Because interventions are expensive, like restoring an active coral is something like $400,000.
Yes. Yes, and I believe that some work that will be needed in the near future is, there's a lot of money that has been allocated to preserving or restoring the reef by government in the recent past, and I think there's a lot of prioritization work that will be needed to know indeed, okay, we have limited resources, how can we allocate those to the projects that will contribute the most likely to reducing pollutants by the largest margin. So yeah, I think there's definitely room for that. I guess it's all about fine-tuning it and making sure it also relies on strong facts and science, right?
There are no further questions.
There is one behind you.
What is the state of integration of the existing governmental decisions? So when the government decides, okay, we are going to build this mine here in this area, basically on economic grounds that we are going to extract this amount of money, like to produce this amount of money and to create this amount of jobs. But then you have the value of the ecosystem service, which is billions of dollars. So what is the state of integration of that value of ecosystem services in the governmental decisions? So that basically the government.
I think government is increasingly aware of all the ecosystem services that are being produced by the Great Barrier Reef, for example. You've got this Outlook report. The new one has been published a few months ago, I believe. And you really have sections now about ecosystem services, about the value of biodiversity, this sort of thing. So all these aspects start being monitored more and more accurately. And yeah, the more we know about the biophysical aspects of it, the easier it gets as well to translate that into economic terms as well. It reduces the uncertainty on all the variables that you want to play with. So I believe that they have quite a fair knowledge already of ecosystem services. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I don't think it's considered in environmental impact assessments as yet. Is it? If that's what you're doing.
Yeah, it's gaining ground. Yeah.
And it's now been massively introduced in the ecosystem accounting. When I look at the ecosystem perspective, and so that's like a new trend. Every country tries to put together ecosystem accounts.
Yes. Yeah. No, definitely.